Dear students, welcome to Darasa Online. The lesson is on language variation. This topic is under the introduction to language. Language variation is a different way on how the same language can be spoken differently depending on the people who speak and the environment where the language is spoken. This discussion is going to show us on how the same language can be spoken differently, and the same language can be used differently depending on the number of factors which we are going to discuss all together. Our discussion is going to be guided by a question which reads, why and how does a language vary? Why and how does a language vary? In answering this question, we are in fact going to discuss about the factors that makes language variation. But before we go and look into those factors, we need to understand what it means by language variation. As I said before, language variation is a different ways on how the same language can be spoken, and different ways on how the same language can be used. If you're talking about English, we have a lot of Englishes. So what makes we have what makes us reach into having all those Englishes? So this is the discussion that we are going to have today. So let us now try to examine the factors that make languages vary. Basically, there are two major factors that make language variation. But apart from those two, we can have several others which are embedded in those two factors. The two factors are dialects and register. These are the two factors that make language variation. Why is it that dialect can make language variation? Why does a register do so? So before we start looking at how do these two make language vary, maybe let us try to examine what it means by dialect and what it means by register. And from there, we can now see how the two make language variation. Dialect is said to be the variation of language according to users. The variation of language according to users. And register, this refers to the variation of language according to use. So as I said, that when we talk about language variation, basically we are discussing or we are looking at how is the language spoken and or how is it being used. So we'll talk about the speakers of the language, and we'll talk about the environment and or different environment where the language is going to be put into use. And those two are the ones that we are going to examine in our discussion. When we talk about the users of the language, we are talking about the speakers. How do the speakers vary to an extent that makes language variation? At this point of view, we'll have to see about 3 different ways and 3 different factors that make language variation. And this will have to begin with an individual himself. A person who uses language. And as such, it makes what we refer as individual dialect. A dialect or a variety of a person as he or she speaks a language. But since a person cannot live by himself in a society, then we find there is another dialect which is referred as social dialect. And within that, we can as well have what is referred as regional dialect. So these 3, they are talk about dialect, the variation of language according to the users. Now, how do these apply? When we talk about individual dialect, some other people say it is idiolect, and all others refer the same as individuality. So when we are talking over all these, what do we exactly mean? And how does this relate with language variation? As human beings, when we want to communicate, we use language, of course. How do we use language? That one differs from one person to another. The way I use language is not the same as the way another person uses language. So individual differences on the way we use language make it different. And this is language variation. So as long as I speak differently and you speak differently, and the choice of words that I make in speaking and the choice of words that you make in speaking, or the way we construct our sentences, is automatically very different. And having that differences, that is what we refer to be individuality. Of course, if I are to mention the areas of our differences when we are talking about the use of language, we refer to areas such as Yeah, we refer to areas such as pronunciation, spelling. We talk about the vocabularies that a person uses, and we talk about grammar. So pronunciation, we are talking about the peculiar way on how a person speaks. And this results to a person or another person being able to identify that the person who is speaking behind the wall could be so and so and so, just because of the way he or she speaks. So the way you sound when you are speaking is different from one person to another. Even the identical twins, you might find they are alike. But when it comes to speaking, they are speaking differently. And even when we talk about writing, especially when it comes to spelling, when you ask two people to write, you find the handwriting are different, and that is all about individuality. That every person has his or her own way on how he or she can use language in terms of these three different areas. When it comes to vocabularies, as I say, every one of us has his or her choice on the use of words. Sometimes some other people, they are in favor of using some certain vocabularies, which you find them, they oftenly use such terms, even if sometimes they use it even if at a place where it's not suitable. So long as it is a vocabulary which is of his or her favor, you'll find him or her keep on using it and repeatedly now and then. When it comes to grammar, of course, the sentences I construct cannot be the same as the one you do, simply because we think differently, even though we want to talk about the same thing. So this is individuality. When it comes to social dialect, as I said before, that human beings don't live in isolation in a society. We are talking about speech community. People who regard themselves as one, as they think they're sharing the same language. But living in a speech community, you find there are some social classes within it. That people find themselves are different from each other because of the social class, social status that they have in the society. So the social differences, the social classes, social stratifications, that can as well make language variation. People who think they belong in a certain or in the same social class, you find the way they speak is different from other people who think they are in a different other social class. Think about people who are educated, the way they use language, the vocabulary they choose to speak, or the vocabulary they choose to write, and even the grammar of their sentences. Definitely, they're different from those who are not educated. Think about the language which is used by the rich. They'll have, or they'll think to have a certain kind of pronunciation which differentiates itself from those others whom we think they are from poor families. And you can name different other social classes that exist within the society. That people who belong to the same class, you'll find them speaking exactly alike, different from others who think they also belong to a different other social class. As I said before, when I talk about individuality, that will be characterized with pronunciation, the choice of the vocabularies, and the construction of the sentences, whether they are ungrammatical and or they are grammatical. That is about social differences. Regional dialect. This is the variation which results from the geographical differences of the people who speak that language. That you might find people are speaking the same language, but they are from two or more different geographical areas. As they are from different geographical areas, you'll find them speaking differently in terms of pronunciation, in terms of vocabulary, and in terms of grammar as well. Now, when we are talking about people who are from different geographical areas, as they differ from pronunciation, how does this happen? We have a common term which we normally refers to the way on how people speak, and especially those who come from the same area. We call it accent, the mannerism on how an individual speaks, which this one will tell exactly the point of origin. It talks about the place where the person comes from. Sometimes accent tries to identify the originality of that person. Think about people from Kilimanjaro, for instance, the way they speak. The way they speak, the accent they use, the mannerism, it tells that these people are from a certain region. And you can think of other different kind of accents. The vocabulary they choose. Now, because of their geographical differences, you might find these people, sometimes they use different vocabularies to refer to the same thing, just because these are living in two different areas. That one society or one particular region will pronounce and or will call a certain entity by a certain name, and another one might refer the same entity with a different other name, and just because of their geographical differences. So at that point, you might find it's like these two people are speaking different languages simply because they have spoken two different words as they are referring to the same entity. Of course, the reason there is very simple, that these people originally were said to have come from the same origin as they were speaking the same language. And because they have dispersed, and later on they came to that different kind of discoveries, that is the reason why they came up with different names or different words referring to the same entity. But all in all, whether they use different vocabularies and all this, they use the same vocabularies, that these people who are from different geographical areas, they can sometimes understand one another and sometimes might not understand one another. They might not be able to understand one another at a point, especially when they find themselves that they are using different vocabularies to refer to the same entity. But different accents might not make the differences. I might give you an example in Tanzania, for instance, that those who could make their dialects regionally, it's like the people from Kilimanjaro, as I mentioned. You talk about the people whom we call them today as Wachaga. Chaga is a society which is believed to have been existed sometime somewhere, a long time ago, that they call themselves Wachaga as they speak Kichaga. But if you go there today and start asking those guys if there's anybody who that speak Kichaga, you might find there's none. You might hear a person speaking Kimachame, Kimarangu, Kibosho, and such kind. But the real Kichaga that we from different other places think or claim to know that there is Kichaga, actually it doesn't exist. Even when you ask those people, when they speak, if they understand one another, actually they don't understand one another. A Machame, when speak to a Marangu guy, the two cannot understand each other. But when we come in Dar es Salaam, when you find them speaking, you might think they are speaking like the same language, but actually they are not. So the truth is, they speak Kichaga, but the Kichaga they are speaking, it has already been diverged. So we are talking about speaking two different varieties of the same language. At this point, we are talking about two people speaking varieties of a language, and end of the day, they fail to understand one another. It's like they are speaking two different languages. Or if I may give you another example of the dialects in Tanzania, like Kisukuma and Kinyamwezi, that these are said to be two different languages. And the way they speak, when you hear them speaking, you might say they are speaking two different languages. But when you trace back the origin of the two, it is said to have come from the same language. So you are also talking about Kisukuma and Kinyamwezi are two dialects of the same language. When a Nyamwezi speaks, a Sukuma guy understands, and vice versa. So since there is mutual understanding between the two, then we are talking about these people, they are sharing the same language, only that there is a variation on how they can deliver the message. So when it comes to English now, which of course, I'll pose this as a question at the end of our discussion, that how do American English differ from British English? So at the end of this discussion, I'm expecting that you can make the differences between American English and British English in terms of these differences. So basically, when we are talking about this is a variety, think about what makes it. It is pronunciation, it is vocabulary, and it is grammar as well. But when it comes to writing, of course, you talk about spelling differences. That the way I write cannot be the same way as you write. That is about language users. Under the same umbrella of language users, we can have a group of other people who use language, social dialect. And at this point, we have different other groups apart from these classes that exist in our societies. Think about people who you can categorize them according to their age differences. I have not talked about educated, for instance, and or vis-a-vis non-educated. But I'm talking about the age group. Here, of course, you can talk about the children, talk about the adults, the old, and or you talk about the youth. How do they vary when they use language? When you talk about children, as they have not well mastered the language, you'll find the kind of vocabulary that they choose to speak. They are those simple vocabularies. And since they have not mastered the language, they might use it sometimes not exactly the way they're supposed to, in terms of their pronunciation, and sometimes the context in which those words are used. But as long as they communicate, then it's okay. Think about the old and think about the youth. How do they use language? The choice of the vocabulary. That the old men and or the old people, they're said to use archaic words. They are said to use old vocabularies. And those vocabularies, they use them in different sayings. And they tend to use a complete sentence as they're trying to express something. Differently from the youth, as they are thinking of using these words which come up and die as we are speaking. We are talking about these people, they are in favor of using the slang terms, the words that they think they want to understand by themselves, the new words that they come in our societies, which when they speak, they might sometimes not be understood by the old, and so forth. So you'll find that age differences can as well make people of these different groups speaking differently. That also is categorized under language variation in terms of uses, as I said. Think about sex. A group of men and female. Do you think they use language in the same way? Of course, because of our physiological differences, we use language differently. Men and women, they don't use the language alike. When it comes to pronunciation, mostly you find women, they have high pitch when they speak, and which their sounds or which their voice is very sophisticated in comparison to men, whom when they speak, they have a low voice. And when it comes to vocabulary, women are said to have a lot of vocabularies compared to men. And in that case, women tend to have complete sentences when they are speaking, as they are expressing themselves. While men, they have short sentences and sometimes incomplete. And they have shortage of vocabularies. That's about sex. So when you find that they are speaking differently, one group having many vocabularies and uses long and complex sentences, that makes how the two groups differ in terms of the use of language. And that is language variation. You talk about occupation. People who are said to have been sharing the same professions. We are talking about areas where language is put into use. For instance, when you talk about teachers, for instance. Teaching is a profession, but the kind of vocabulary that you use, they are of a common core vocabularies. With this, we cannot say that there is a variety of language that they speak. At this point here, we are talking about those subjects, those disciplines of specialization. Think about the lawyers. Think about the doctors. And you can think of other professions that they have some technical vocabularies that they use when they are speaking. So those technical vocabularies that they use, they are only understood by only those people in that specialty, in that profession. So with that, we find that having that special vocabulary which are understood only by them, and though those vocabularies, they are of the same language that we are speaking, that again is a language variation. So if you find the doctors in hospital, the way they describe, the vocabulary they use, it's different from those that we are using in our normal communication. But is that not English? It is English as well, but they are using technical terms to describe the same thing that we can use it in our normal conversation. Now, that one again is the factor that makes language variation. I have tried to talk about the people who are using language. So all these, we are said to be people using language. But how do they use it? The way one group or the way one person uses is different from the another one. People of different professions used to choose words according to the fields that they belong. That you cannot find a lawyer, for instance, try to use some technical terms or some technical vocabularies of a doctor and or of a different other profession which he or she doesn't belong. What I'm trying to say about occupation is at that point when people of the same profession trying to share some certain vocabularies that cannot be found in a different other field. But this should not be confused by different other people by maybe. When we think about technical vocabularies being found in these different fields, they are all of English language. But the way we use, they have to be used depending on the fields in which the person belongs. But again, this sex, as I said before, that men and women, as they use language differently. So it comes a time whereby we find women have a lot of vocabularies depending on the activities that they perform. And with that, we cannot only talk about sex, we can as well talk about sex vis-a-vis gender. So since gender, it has to do with the social activities and or the relationship that exists between men and women, and which therefore, for this case, when you talk about sex, we can as well say it is more or less the same as gender. The second base of language variation is, as I said, register is a variation of language according to use. How do we use language? We use it everywhere where we meet and when the need of communication arises. So in this case, in terms of how we use language, I would want to draw your attention on 3 different areas on where we use language. We'll talk about the environment where the language is put into use, and we technically call this province. Some other scholars they call it field of discourse. Field, the environment, discourse, any utterance that makes or that facilitates communication. So we are talking about the environment where language is put into use that can make communication. And when we think about those environments, we can have a variety of environment. Think about the place where you are at the moment. And think about the place where you might sometimes go, sometimes after. Are they the same environment? Now, as long as there are different environments, you might find the language that you use at the place where you are is different from the language which you are going to use somewhere else. Think about the language that people use when they are in restaurants, and or the language that you use when you are at the market or at the football pitch. The kind of sentences, the vocabulary that you use, are they the same? Let me give you an example. When you go to a restaurant, as you want to order, let's say, a certain type of food, you may ask maybe to bring like rice and chicken. According to the Tanzanian context, the service provider may ask you, nani wali mbuzi, nani mbuzi, nani kuku. But the question there clicks like, are you really a chicken or a goat? But that is the language that they use, and which of course is acceptable. But when you come to a different other area from the restaurant, it is difficult, and it is impossible for the one to use such kind of expression. So this is the variation of language I'm talking about. You find a person as he passes by carrying ukwaju. You call him ukwaju, and he or she responds. But is that his or her real name? It is only because of the activity that he performs. Language variation. So we need to adapt, or we need to use language accordingly, according to the environment, according to the surroundings. And that will be said to be the appropriate use of language. Medium, whether it's been spoken or written. We are told that spoken language is different from written one. Starting from vocabulary themselves and the grammar. When we speak, sometimes we are using ungrammatical sentences. When we speak, the choice of words, most of them are very informal, because that is informal communication. Differently, when you write, you have to choose about formal vocabularies. Your sentences must be grammatically correct. And there are many more other things which are included under spoken differently from those that we could have under written. So again, it depends. If you want to pass your message through speaking, it can't be the same as when you are writing. And the last that I want to discuss here is about tenor of discourse. The relationship that exists between the participants. How do I relate with a person I'm talking to? Is our relationship of the same status? Is it intimate? Or one is superior than the other? I'm not talking about age here. There might be age difference, but they are of the same status. And so the language that they will use will be very common, very intimate, just because of their relationship. But if, for instance, that you're talking about, let's say, the employer and the employee, or in this situation, we are talking about a teacher and a student, that we believe the relationship, there is a distance between them, and of which the language which is going to be spoken here won't be the same as when the language which is spoken between students themselves. And we, of course, sometimes some other people say it depends on even the subject matter of discussion. So when we choose the kind of the vocabulary that we should speak, we also need to look at how do we relate, how intimate or how far do the two people think about at the time when you meet with a stranger, a person that you have never come across with. And at times, again, you meet with a person whom you are familiar with. How are you going to address to the two of them? definitely the way you're going to address a stranger is different from the way you're going to address a person who is familiar to you. All that, we call it language variation. So what I want to say here is, at a moment when you make what you speak different from one time to another time and to different people, you're trying to make a variety of its own. So sometimes some people ended up saying that it's like we might all speaking English, but a variety of English I'm speaking is different from a variety that we are speaking. So we can have as many varieties as possible in one language. This is something that you need to know as from now and on. But all in all, what we are told that we need to make sure that whichever kind of a variety that one uses, the aim should be communication. That you have to make sure you facilitate communication. That the message that you intend to deliver has to be delivered and has to be understood. And this is why we are now told that when you go to a place or to a place that they use a certain kind of variety, and you have to adjust yourself to know that, okay, I should also use this kind of variety so that I might be understood by the people who are in there. Because if you strictly think that you should retain the variety and all the language variety that you speak at a different place, you might not be able to be understood on the other hand. And or probably you might enter into a conflict between. Imagine you are just passing in street and find the young men and boys smoking marijuana, for instance, and as they are chatting and doing whatever. And when you pass there, you start greeting them by using your Assalamu alaikum or your Bwana Yesu asifiwe. But those guys will think like mambo so that you might sound the same as them. And from that, you'll be accepted. So to cement what we have been trying to discuss in relation to this topic, I would want us to look at the two varieties of language and try to examine the area of their differences. We have these two standard Englishes. We have American English and we have British English. The two Englishes are said to be standard because they have both been accepted to be used in our communication. But as long as they are varieties and or as long as they are dialects, when an American speaks, of course, a British understands and vice versa. But my interest here is I want you to establish their differences in terms of, one, pronunciation, two, spelling, and for grammar. So these areas, they're the ones that make British English look different from American English. But though there are some which are the same. You can find they're using a certain vocabulary which is the same from British and America. A certain word might be pronounced by British the same as the way the American pronounce, the grammar and such. So I want you to establish those things that makes British English look different from American English in terms of pronunciation, spelling, vocabulary, and grammar. In simple language, I want you to come up with examples. How do the American pronounce a certain word differently from American? If I may give you one example in pronunciation, the British would pronounce as magazine, while the American would pronounce it as magazine. That's one word. Think about the spelling. This is for the British. This is for the American. The vocabulary. The British will talk about a lorry and the American will talk about a truck. When it comes to grammar, this is where you find the American. They are in most cases overgeneralizing, that they don't want to make trouble, especially when it comes to those irregular verbs in terms of forming their past tenses. For instance, they will talk about the past tense and the participle of the verb learn to be learned, and instead, as for the British, have it as what? Learned. When it comes to the use of prepositions, sometimes you find the Americans use on at a place where the British use at, in, and on. But as long as the Americans say, okay, those are just grammatical words, their aim is just to make a sentence look grammatically okay. So in that case, then the British would strictly want to emphasize on the use of those, but the Americans, they would say, as long as we understand each other when we speak, there's no problem for that. And that is why and how language vary when we are using it as we communicate. Dear students, thank you very much for listening. Keep on watching Darasa Online.